palm oil, and the work of the Forest Peoples Program concerned with logging, plantations, palm oil, extractive industries, dams, colonization, and protected areas. It's a general concern. We look at the last couple of centuries, these big chunks of the population have learned to look at the world around us in terms of what can be turned into money, what can be turned into profit. And that's led us into a corner of this country. Share with us about it.
Okay, good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me to this challenging and diverse conference. My talk is titled Indigenous People's Rights and the Preservation of the World. I'll explain later where that title comes from. I'm trying to share some of the lessons I've learned, over the last 40 years working with Indigenous peoples. Initially in the Amazon, I did several years, and then working in Central Africa, Southeast Asia, where I mainly work now. So I'm going to dive straight in and rattle you through a whole series of pictures and thoughts. One recent estimate suggests that there are some 6,780 extant languages in the world. Of these, it's further guesstimated that there's about two-thirds, let's say 4,500 languages that are spoken by people who are referred to as indigenous peoples. When we speak of indigenous peoples, what we mean is people who govern themselves by custom, who live outside the framework of modern states, or at least did so until recently, who retain strong attachment to their lands and territories, and who suffer discrimination for being different. Now, it so happens, though it's hardly an accident, that most of the world's remaining biological diversity is found on indigenous peoples' lands. That's the biodiversity, the species, the ecosystems, the biomes that make up the living world that we all depend on for our survival. So our survival is bound up with what happens to indigenous peoples. Since the middle of the 19th century, and a little earlier if you look carefully, there's been a growing realization that we are in the grave danger of destroying the natural world upon which we depend. We're polluting our atmosphere to the point of making human survival difficult, or even impossible. And you all know the statistics, I'm not going to rehearse them. So hence there's been the emergence of this powerful movement for conservation. The earliest proponent of a national park that I've been able to find was made by the remarkable romantic artist George Catlin, who sought refuge from what he perceived as the crassness and greed of urban America in the Wild West, where he perceived the noble Indians' guiltless lives being undermined by disease, firewater, and land grabbing. He conceived the idea of preserving such an area for posterity, and he wrote, "And in future, what a splendid contemplation when one imagines them as they might be seen, by some great protecting policy of government preserved in their beauty and wildness, in a magnificent park, where the world could see for ages to come the native Indian in his classic attire, galloping his wild horse with sinewy bow and shield and lance amid the fleeting herds of elks and buffaloes. A nation's containing man and beast in all the wild and freshness of their under nature's beauty. He was a remarkable man. However, by the time the first national parks were actually established, Yellowstone and Yosemite in the 1870s and 1880s, the Indian wars with Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull and the like had reached their inevitable and tragic end. So the national parks that were established were then administered by the army. They were defended by forts, and the hundreds of native inhabitants from those areas were excluded from their territories by force. And actually, killings and forced expulsions of indigenous peoples from such national parks continued right up until the 1960s. Tragically, it's this model of conservation that was to dominate conservation efforts throughout the 20th century. In India, as many as 500,000 tribal people have been forcibly expelled to make way for national parks. And in Africa, the same process is still underway. The model was set in the Serengeti, traditional lands of the Maasai people. A national park, argued Bernard Zinnick, the founder of the park, he said, must remain a primordial wilderness to be effective. No man, not even native ones, should live inside its borders. 50,000 Maasai were expelled. That same notion passed into law. According to the US Wilderness Act of 1964, wilderness is a place where a man himself is a visitor who does not remain. This is how the High Kom people of Etosha, in what is now Namibia, first heard that their traditional lands were declared a game reserve. This was in 1954. I have come here to tell you that it is the order of the administration that you move out of Game Reserve number 2. The reason for this order is that you are destroying the game. You must take your women and children with you, also your stock. You will have to be out of Game Reserve by the 1st of May, 1954. If you are still in the Game Reserve on that day, you will be arrested and will be put in jail. You will be regarded as trespassers. If you have something to say, I will listen. But I wish to tell you that there is no appeal against this order. Convey what you have heard to your absent friends and relatives. Where do these mutually reinforcing prejudices against indigenous peoples and that nature can only be conserved by in so-called wildernesses, where do they come from? Of course, they go back a long way. On the one hand, Judeo-Christian traditions tell of an origin in which man was given dominion over the beasts. Even the world's most ancient epic, the tale of Gilgamesh, recounts the primordial struggle between kingly civilization and the forests, the source of all evil and brutishness. In ancient Greece, untamed nature was perceived as the domain of wild, irrational female forces that contrasted with the rational culture ordered by males. In this worldview, not only was nature a dangerous threat to the city-state, but the wilderness beyond was peopled by barbarians, the epitome of whom were the Amazons, long-haired, naked, female savages, much like the Scythians of the steppes in appearance and in their perceived lawlessness. Pioneering Christian fundamentalists brought these same views of nature to the New World, where they found them strongly reinforced. Beset from the first by naked, long-haired salvages who knew nothing of Christ or modesty, their precarious frontier world depended on taming nature as they sought to wrest a living from a hostile wilderness. As one local poet wrote in 1662, the forests of the New World were a waste and howling wilderness where none inhabited, and hellish fiends and brutish men that devils worshipped. Of course, the indigenous peoples who bore the brunt of this colonization and conservation had quite different ideas of nature. For example, Ruby Dunstan of the Nahapamuks people of the Stein Valley in Alberta, who fought to prevent the logging of their ancestral land, has remarked, "I never thought of the Stein Valley as a wilderness. My dad used to say, that's our pantry. We knew all about the plants and animals, when to pick, when to hunt. We knew because we were taught every day. It's like we were pruning every day." But some of the white environmentalists seem to think that if something was declared a wilderness, no one was allowed inside it because it was so fragile. So they have put a fence around it, or maybe around themselves. We can trace the idea of game reserves far back in history. As early as 700 BC, the Assyrian kings set aside areas for royal hunts. Emperor Ashoka established a similar tradition in India in 400 BC. Alexander the Great and his followers introduced the idea of hunting reserves, called paradises in Persian, into Europe. Emperor Charlemagne established royal hunting reserves called forests across Western Europe, and it was the Normans who introduced that idea into England with the establishment of the New Forest, actually the first forest in our country. By the time of Henry II, almost 25% of the realm